Bruce Trudgeon. And I first heard Bruce at a college. It was one of those extended education classes that they do for campus day. And he gave a very, very interesting presentation, and it was about the history of the building of the Mackinac Bridge and the ships, and it was very nice. It can't be it was longer. He doesn't have time to do the whole thing tonight, so he's going to take the choice bits out of that. But it was a very interesting speaker. I think you're going to enjoy it a lot. Bruce lives in Acme. He graduated from Michigan State. He was a mechanical engineer, worked for GM for 30 years and is now retired, but he understands the workings of boats and cars and all that. That's one reason I mentioned that. So I Googled him just before I left work tonight, and lo and behold, I found a copy from the Spartan Engineer, Volume 7, Number 4, May of 1954. I think he might have been
I was a senior at that time.
A senior at Michigan State, and he wrote that article about the pipeline that went across the straits there.
One that's guaranteed not to.
And unfortunately, when I went to print, the wrong pages came out, so I don't have the article with me, but I just put in his name and pipeline and MSU and it'll probably come up. But from the Spartan Engineering, isn't it? That's cool.
I'll have to Google myself and see what else is there.
Okay, mostly it was about the fact he was going to speak tonight. My gosh, our publicity is really good. We're in about 6 places. So I'm not going to spend any more time, but congratulations. He said to make sure you guys know he's a Spartan.
That article, the Spartan Engineer magazine, the article in there, what happened was in the summer of 1953, I was working at the Straits of Mackinac, and they were putting 2 underwater oil pipelines across the straits, and these are the pipelines that have been in the news recently, okay? We put those under there in 1950. I have a slideshow about it, done a number of times with people, though. That's really interesting stuff. But anyway, it's interesting that at that time they said, these are going to last for 50 years. Well, 50 years would be 2003, I think. And they're still going, which is why some people get a little nervous about the pipelines up there. Incidentally, that company that did that was Merritt, Chapman, and Scott. And the following year, they began building the Mackinac Bridge. They were the largest underwater marine construction company in the world, and they did all of the underwater foundation work for the Mackinac Bridge. And the following year, the U.S. Steel came in and did the top of it. But part of the interesting thing about that is that was at that time, the whole world was changing from steam power to diesel power. And I've got pictures of the equipment using to do the pipeline, which is the same equipment used to foundation the bridge. I mean, it's literally steam shovels, steam dredges. It was steam boats. It was the age of steam. And of course, the technology then was very crude compared to what we have today. And you can wonder how that bridge went together as well as it did with the technology they had. Subject is working boats in Mackinac. Of course, we think, oh, this would be the ferries that take people to the island, and the auto ferries and the railroad ferries. But what has gone on in Mackinac over the years is everything has involved boats. There have been really 5 different economies at Mackinac. The first was the fur trade from the early 1600s to the mid-1800s, and everything moved by boat. Mostly canoes to start out with. So everything that happened involved boats. The next thing was the fishing economy that came in the 1700s, and the richest fishery in North America was between Beaver Island and Mackinac Island. So there was a lot of fishing going on. It was a fishing economy. And then what happened next was the railroads came. Well, now it became a railroad economy. And this then the tourism began at that time. And the auto ferries came in, and as the business of the railroad ferries died out, the auto ferries picked up. So there's always been something going on at Mackinac that people lived off of. involved boats. And of course, over all those years, people only lived where they make a living. Today, we have government handouts, if we call it that. A person can live almost anywhere, even without a job. Well, in those days, if there wasn't work there, you're going to leave town. So everybody was there for a reason, for one of those.
You want this?
No,
you're all right.
The first boats, the people who usually go across the straits are probably a coracle. A coracle is made of tree branches, been around with animal skins stretched over, and sometimes they would use the skin of a bull buffalo and call it a bull boat. But those were, without a doubt, the first people who tried to go across the straits. Probably had a boat like this, and probably the first time out, the current took them over in northern Lake Huron someplace, because there's a current flowing through there from 2 to 4 miles an hour from west to east. The next boats probably were dugout canoes. A little better than a coracle, and probably a few of those went across the straits, not very seaworthy. But the boats that really made the area were the canoes. Now, bark canoes were built any place there were birch trees or elm trees, and you can make a canoe with elm bark, although it's more difficult than birch bark. And the different tribes had little variations on it, but the Chippewa canoe is the one that ended up in the Great Lakes. And there have been over the years thousands of these canoes used in Mackinac, back and forth, from north to south, and off back and forth to the island. That was how the Indians got around. The fur traders came. First the explorers and the fur traders. There were fur traders in Mackinac before the Pilgrims landed. How did they get there? With boats. Everything came and went with boats, canoes. And Mackinac was the crossroads of the fur trade. For a lot of years, the only reason for people to be in much of North America was the fur trade. And Mackinac, up until around 1800, was the crossroads. All those black lines are canoe routes, and then later on sailing ships all come from Mackinac. Furs are heavy. First, they were bringing in trade goods, trade to the Indians for furs. Furs were heavy. They needed boats to carry this heavy stuff. And then, of course, the Indians knew how to make canoes of any size. They got the Indians to make the big canoes. They were called a Montreal canoe to start with, because the fur business, all of the managers that come out of Montreal, and they sort of control the language of the business. They were also called Superior canoes because they were used between Mackinac and the western end of Lake Superior. So the Montreal canoe really was the first really, what you call a freight-hauling workboat at Mackinac. This is the only boat that's really peculiar to Mackinac. It's called a Mackinac boat. And it was, they got their idea from a boat called the York boat that the Hudson Bay Company had brought in to use in place of large canoes, made a boat similar to this. But they made a little larger version, put 2 masts on it, and this was the working boat during the fishing years. Until they had power boats, all those fish were caught with these boats, and later on they became the recreational boats in Mackinac. In the 1840s, the American Fur Company shipping 20,000 barrels of salted fish from Mackinac each year, and all of those fish were caught in those Mackinac boats. And later on, of course, the what they call the fish tugs, and there's no doubt that the fish tugs were used a great deal for things other than fishing, because there were a lot of them in Mackinac. Another thing that really changed things with boats was you get a sawmill. This is the reconstructed sawmill at what's it called? Mill Creek up east of the Straits. As soon as there were sawmills, they could get lots of lumber cut much more cheaply, and then they began building more and bigger wood boats. And the bateau. Now, the bateau was a type boat that was used all over North America, and the bateau then replaced the large canoes on the Great Lakes. And now this is the boat that would go back and forth hauling the freight. The first sailing ship, called a deck vessel, was the Griffin. The Griffin that's been in the news a good bit lately, because some folks think maybe they have found it. The Griffin was built above Niagara Falls. It was built for the fur trade. For many years, any boat of any size on the lakes the money came from the fur trade. And the Griffin came to Detroit, came to Mackinac, loaded with trade goods for the fur trade, left Mackinac, took the trade goods over to Green Bay, unloaded that, loaded up with furs, headed back, never saw the boat again. The first steam vessel on the Great Lakes, again, was bankrolled by the fur trade. Walk in the water, making regular trips, Detroit to Mackinac, so that was the first really power boat that we used at Mackinac. About this time, this was the beginning of the tourism. The mid-1800s, the late 1800s, tourism was beginning, and there were boats, there were dozens of these palace steamers, as they were called, running the lakes, taking people around. The early ones, of course, the side wheelers, and these boats were coming to Mackinac, bringing people there as part of the tourist trade. Then, 1881, the railroads arrived there. Railroads came from the north, they came from the south, and from the south they brought tourists. They wanted to go to Mackinac Island. Then the cruise ships came. Again, bringing people up there. Tourist business was growing. The cruise ships got larger and larger. 1887, biggest single event for tourism in Mackinac was the Grand Hotel. That's how it looked in 1887. Of course, a lot of those, and all those large cruise boats were making Mackinac a destination or an important stop on their cruise. This is the last, I took this picture in 1953. This is a South American coming into the harbor of Mackinac Island. The South American was the last Great Lakes cruise ship. Final trip in 1967. Any of you ever cruise on the North American or the South American? Here it is that same day, tied up at the island. There were many, many boats over the years that took people to the island. And I haven't found any source that shows me all of these boats. But one of the early ones was the El Domo. It started out as a railroad ferry and was a Mackinac Island boat. And just a sampling and it's amazing how large they were. You know, today, the boats going to Mackinac Island, there's one good-sized boat that hauls freight. The others are quite small. But years ago, here's one of the early Arnold Transit Company boats. Years ago, they were these big boats going to the island. This is more recent. The first auto ferry in Mackinac was 1923, but there was a lot of cars before 1923. And if you want to take your car across the straits before 1923, you had to go on one of the railroad ferries. These guys are lined up to go on a railroad ferry. There were two big ice-breaking railroad ferries working. This is the Chief Wawa. The Chief Wawatam was the most powerful vessel on the Great Lakes up until World War II when the icebreaker Mackinac arrived. It's an icebreaker, and at their convenience they would take your car across. Now there was a couple problems with taking your car across on the Wawatam. First of all, they didn't run a schedule to take cars, so you might wait 2 or 3 days. And the fare was $40 one way. On a round trip of $80, you could buy a used car on the other side. So, and of course, in the wintertime, it didn't, there have been times in the winter that nothing moves across Mackinac because of the ice. They could carry 100 cars in a load. Which brings us to the Mackinac auto ferries. What I've left out of this program is the railroad ferries and some of the other stuff, so I'll try to pick this because some of you may have ridden on some of these boats. The Ariel, 1923, was the first Michigan auto ferry. It took a half a dozen cars, was not particularly successful. About the same time, they purchased two boats called the Colonel Pond and the Colonel Card, They'd been built in 1920, about the end of World War I, and they were going to be World War I minesweepers. Well, by the time they launched them, the war was pretty well over. So there were new boats, two of them that were identical. And the state of Michigan bought these two boats, took them to a shipyard, cut them in half, made them 50 feet longer, and turned them into auto ferries. And named them the St. Agnes and the Mackinac City. So the other one's identical, and I'm not going to show you pictures of both of them here today. Now here's a nice new dock in St. Agnes in 1925. Pretty nice, huh? A little nicer over in Mackinac City. So these are the docks. And these boats do not go through ice. So this is only a fair weather experience. Well, guess what? They couldn't begin to keep up with the traffic. Couldn't begin to keep up with the traffic. So, they sent these two, the Mackinac City and the St. Agnes, they sent them back to the shipyard and they widened them. They made them 8 feet wider on both sides, above the water line. From the water line up, the track comes out. Now these boats they can carry more cars now. That's going to solve the problem. Well, so now for the first time a boat was built specifically for the state of Michigan for an auto ferry. This is Straits of Mackinac. And that boat went into service in 1928 and operated continuously up until 1957 when the bridge went up. This was going to solve the problem. But it didn't. So they added an upper deck. Take more cars. Now they added an upper deck to the St. Agnes and the Mackinac City. Now you've got 3 of these ferries with 2 decks. Certainly you can keep up with the traffic now. How do they load those things? Well, with elevators. There's an elevator that lifts the cars one at a time to the upper deck. At the same time, they're loading into the side. All these ferries are side loading. They're loading cars on the main deck through the doors on the side. They're taking this elevator to get the cars up to the second deck. Didn't solve the problem. Can't keep up. This is a picture, a current picture of Mackinac City, and in the background you see one of those elevators still there. How many people up there know what that is when they see it? There was a problem, of course, getting cars across in the wintertime. So there were 2 big ice-breaking railroad ferries operating. This is the second one, the St. Marie, they're called the second St. Marie. And the state hired that, they hired that boat to move cars in the wintertime. January, February, March. At that time, there were a number of, this is an ice-breaking railroad ferry, and there were a number of these ferrying railroad cars back and forth across Lake Michigan because at that time the rail yards in the early 1900s, the rail yards around Chicago were pretty congested, not managed too well, and it was actually cheaper to take these cars further north and go across the lake. But they were getting their act together in Chicago, so there are a number of these boats available. So the state of Michigan bought one. They bought the Ann Arbor No. 4. This was built in 1906. This was an ice-breaking, not really an icebreaker, but it has ice-breaking capability, railroad ferry. Now all the railroad ferries loaded and unloaded off